Be a man, or a similar phrase, has always got me intrigued, because it almost always comes packaged with a specific set of instructions from someone else. And so I can't help but wonder, be a man for whose sake? That contradiction, that's something I'd like to talk about today. There's a version of masculinity that moves through most spaces right now with a very consistent message. One of independence and discipline, emotional control, one that tells you to not rely on others but instead lead and provide. It shows up in church, in political rhetoric, in fitness culture, and across an entire industry of online content built specifically around the idea of the strong and self-sufficient man. Now, I'm not going to argue that these things are inherently worthless, but there is something worth looking at in the structure underneath the message. What's actually being asked of the man who follows that framework? Strength and leadership for who? And what purpose does emotional control serve? The framework doesn't really invite those questions, and that's probably not an accident. The masculine ideal being sold in most of these spaces, whether it is religious, political, or influencer driven, is roughly the same regardless of the source. It requires a man to suppress his own internal experience, dismiss his own social needs, and defer to a pre-written code about what strength looks like. And that code changes depending on who's issuing it. Think God's design for men, the nation's need for disciplined citizens, or the alpha system for dominance. But the requirement is the same. Set aside your own judgment and follow this definition that has been prepared for you. So instead of independence, you end up in a compliance structure. When you track who benefits or could benefit from a man that doesn't examine his own emotional experience, the framework becomes a lot more clear. An emotionally suppressed man is easier to direct. He doesn't stop to question whether the assignment makes sense. He doesn't need his experiences and suffering acknowledged before he continues. He just performs. And that is useful if you're building, say, an army, or filing a workforce, or selling a course on how to stop being weak. The religious framing runs on a similar logic. Submission to God's authority is explicitly the point, but the behavioral output that gets labeled as a godly masculinity, provider, protector, emotionally restrained, or hierarchically obedient, those serve an institutional stability more than they serve the individual man practicing it. And not that I think that's necessarily the intention, but it is the outcome. An alpha influencer culture is where this gets most transparent. The product being sold is independence from needing validation, but the man buying it needs the influencer to define what that independence looks like, and what it costs, what it proves, and who gets to recognize it. He switched one approval structure for another, and in this case there's a subscription fee attached to it. This sort of lone wolf aesthetic is a product. It has branding, it has a customer base, and the man performing it is the market. And so the question after all of this is the following. If the framework doesn't serve the man inside it, why does it stick? Why does it hold? Why does it perpetuate? And I think this is where it gets a lot more complicated, but I'll simply put, part of it is timing. This sort of framework, this model gets taught to a boy before there's any tools to properly examine it. It arrives in childhood, it is reinforced through socialization, through education, being raised by your parents, and through how the adults around you respond to what you show them. And so, by the time that this boy is old enough to question it, it's pretty much become their own thinking. And the other part is the cost of exit. because questioning the framework doesn't happen in a vacuum. It typically happens in front of other men acting within the same framework. And with any social group, there is a cost that comes from deviation. The man who starts asking questions isn't just challenging an idea, but he's risking how he's valued by the people around him. Social positioning in general is built on a few parameters: knowing the rules, performing them consistently. It shows a type of validation of how to think and to act that is correct, and more importantly, it gives belonging. And a man who starts to deviate doesn't just risk losing the safety of the framework, but he risks losing the social standing that came with it. So most men don't leave. They just privately but perform publicly. The topic of loneliness among men is a good example of how something like that can play out. It's an actively discussed topic. Men share the statistics, they engage with the content, they acknowledge it as a real problem. But the same men who engages with that content will rarely admit to someone that they've been experiencing something similar, or at least they'll really have to think of who they admit this to. The phenomenon itself is safe to discuss, but the personal admission isn't. And I think that's a very important nuance to make here. That once it comes to a more internal experience or emotion, there's sort of a hard wall or hurdle that needs to be climbed to talk about it with other men more in depth. And that in of itself is its own problem, but to me, it does explain why this framework can reproduce itself without anyone actively defending it. Nobody needs to, because the social cost of leaving does that work. And so a man who fully executes this masculine framework, this emotionally contained, self-reliant, defers to his authority structure, performs strength consistently, has in practice handed his entire way of thinking and judgment to whoever wrote it. He doesn't respond to situations based on his own read of them. Instead, he runs them through a filter that's been placed there for him and simply produces the approved output. And I'm not exempt from this. In fact, most men aren't. We grew up being taught a version of right and wrong and have built our entire worldview on top of that. So to break with that is incredibly difficult. And the irony in there is functional. The man most celebrated for being strong in this framework is often the man who has the least autonomous relationship with his own decision making. He's not thinking, he's executing. And when that framework produces a bad outcome, say a destroyed relationship or like health issues from years of suppression, he doesn't have the internal tools to analyze it, because building those tools was framed as a weakness and thus unnecessary from the start. This model had its use. It was built for a society that needs people or needed people to function over everything. Soldiers and factory workers, people who serve a use and who don't ask too many questions. But our world has gotten way more complex since then. The phrase, "be a man," has been issued by governments during wartime, by churches building congregations, and by fathers passing down what they were handed, and now by men with a cause to sell. And while the world got a lot more complex, the ask has stayed the same. Don't trust your own internal voice, but trust ours. What that produces isn't a strong man, but a man who is strong in a very specific direction his authority structure needs him to be, but remains brittle everywhere else. So when I wonder, be a man, for whose sake? It's definitely not yours. Thanks for watching.